Well, that was a wonderful set of presentations. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Osama for coming up with this construct, because I think all of these presentations have been proof of how interesting it is. Now, as I said, our speakers all had a chance to type what they were reading, and I have not. So what you're going to hear from me is just very briefly, not a summary as much as a set of ideas that I hope will help you to formulate questions for them. But I'm going first to ask them to speak to one another, either as commentary or as questions about the way in which we have heard them conceive of the subject. So if I am correct, and I may well not be, we've heard sort of at least three ways to think about what the Indian Ocean is through this history of ideas. And one is as a canvas for writing and for history, including the history of empires and also the intersections of empires and development. The second, as a medium of exchange, to adopt Osama's idea. And third, the Indian Ocean as an idea or a provocation of how we understand the relationship between space, which we already understand in different ways, and the ideas and peoples who populate those spaces. And I should say, to me, hearing these presentations is perhaps the best proof that anyone who worries about contemporary politics should start off by reading history. Because there's nothing that came through these presentations that isn't in some way directly related to experiences we are watching or trying to understand now. So on the first, there's the question of the construction of space, of history, of cultures, of politics, and of people, and the combinations of global, regional, and local histories and peoples, and the relationships between such ways of understanding them as between, for example, imperial and subaltern histories. And I think what we heard was a very interesting combination, sort of a weaving in and out of the ways in which our assumptions about these very often can be changed by looking at a place which is only a place in the minds of the people who traverse it in the first instance, and only secondly, a set of maps, very much mental maps, as well as diplomatic maps, economic maps, and of course, political maps. So I would urge all of you to think of your questions in light of the idea of space, history, culture, politics, and people, and as well in terms of historiography, of the way in which we think about history and ethnography of various sorts as intersections, including in the case that Gaurav offered us, ethnography through literature. The second is to say that a great deal of this is about migration. But one of the ways in which these papers challenge us is to think about migration both voluntary and involuntary, and sometimes both at the same time. So we have the Hajj as one, we have transportation as another, we have travel as a third. And we, of course, have commerce as an overarching lens for all of this. So we have both trajectories of personal migration, and then we have ruptures based upon the ways in which power intersects with personal and group initiative, in a way. So in this sense, as I think Gaurav quite beautifully pointed out, historiography can be simply the writing of the person and the place at the same time, but it's also about how we think of the Indian Ocean as a whole. And that's where these three contrasting presentations, I think, are very, very useful, because it's not just what you see on a map. It's the way that various parts of this map intersect with one another, and then intersect with pieces of the globe that don't look as though they are necessarily connected by land or even by water, but by the way in which human interaction creates that space. I'd also note that when we talk about oceanic crossings, as all of you did, I think most of us don't think of it in quite the way that Niall talked about it, where it's not just the territories that surround a body of water, but it is the way in which that body of water becomes an actor all itself. I mean, Anand talked a bit about Kalapani as a cultural artifact or an artifact of faith as well, but it also is a physical being that plays a role in all of our ideas of what we are talking about. The intersections between travel and imprisonment and exile were also extremely interesting to me because they tended to not just intersect but to kind of cross over each other. I mean, clearly imprisonment is not the same thing as travel, but it, in this case, involves travel. Travel is not always voluntary. Exile is sometimes accidental, but in each case we have the dislocations of people with some source emanating from a place at one point or another. So I heard much of this as history through the voices of those who were reflecting on their own experience, regardless or because of caste and class, and history through the changing ideas of modernity, in a sense, because that it kind of comes through this. And that is the intersections of developing ideas of what the national could be and of spaces that we later designate as territory related to sovereignty. So for many of us, this is reading retrospectively and understanding this elsewhere. So for me, and I'm not an historian, I worry about contemporary politics and understand this as a piece of what we all need to learn. The implications for our current time are very clear, because it's recognizing the many currents of thought that still and should inform today's politics. And among the pieces we didn't talk about, but really stands out in my mind for many reasons having to do with the last 2.5 decades, are what was only mentioned by one of you, and that had to do with Aden and more directly with Hadramaut and with Hadramis, and the way in which that migration was both voluntary and involuntary and involved as much sea currents as it did the motions of empire as well. So, if we think about this as changing notions of what a region is, as well as changing notions of what this region is, I think we have a great deal to discuss. And I'd like to suggest that we open it first to our three speakers to raise whatever questions they might want to for each other, or to clarify anything that they didn't have a chance to say at the beginning. Gentlemen.
I could. Perhaps I'm sitting here next in line, so perhaps I'll start us off. I have a few responses and reflections for Gaurav's paper. And I was really fascinated that you brought up in Hamburg, partly because I used to live there. I read my PhD there, in fact, and I'm very fond of any mention of Hamburg. But I think, of course, it has this long history as the Hansestadt Hamburg, as the Hanseatic city in the Hanseatic League. And, of course, in terms of world history and migration, it's always thought of it as being the great Central European port for Atlantic migration, of course, the Americas. But in that sort of brief period that you're dealing with, when Germany has an empire, Hamburg is its great imperial port. The university is founded expressly as a kind of a colonial and mercantile studies university. I think this is really important to bring this in, and this sort of period of German imperialism, and as Susan Marchand has written about, German Orientalism. But what struck me with resonance with my own interest, really, was Emily Reuter, or as she became, her conversion. Because just like, in a sense, the British Empire was an evangelical empire for part of its period as well, so in many ways the German different states, and indeed the German Empire, had this dimension too. A few years ago I worked with the materials from the Evangelische Missionsgesellschaft zu Basel, the greatest and most important of all the Germanic missionary societies. And one of the things I was looking at there was this figure, this missionary figure called Karl Gottlieb Pfander. And the various local figures he employed to translate, and this is this issue again of language and books, to translate aspects, different books of the Bible, they themselves started off, as it were, using those language skills to start their own careers as translators, as writers, in one case as a professor. And that really made me kind of think, reflect on what's happening with Emily Reuter, as you explained, that she's making a living, not necessarily making a fortune, but making a living out of her book. And then I thought, really, to bring it back to what we've all talked about migration. There's this wonderful line, I forget, from Levi-Strauss's Triste Tropique, when he explains that movement in space always involves movement in the social order as well, either up or down. And I think in many ways that's what I think we're kind of dealing with here, particularly when there's an element of literacy and biliteracy, let's say, bilingualism, that physical mobility in a sense becomes a form of social mobility too. And I think perhaps in some of the cases, even in what you've talked about, Anand, too, even though these are prisoners, some of them at least emerge as have a sort of an entrepreneurial spirit as well, that seem to establish themselves in a way that mobility, their very mobility gives them kind of new, at least kind of mixes up the social order and allows some of them to rise up above it. So those are really my reflections, I guess, on the two. I'm sort of in a way trying to tie together.
Yeah. No, thanks, Niall. I mean, I really do need to work through more of the German part of the material that you're raising. But what you say about mobility is really interesting, because one of the main concerns of Emily's, of course, in that narrative is that she's losing social status. Not, because she comes as the daughter of the Sultan, has her own plantations, has a number of slaves. She's a fairly well-off woman, and then all of a sudden she finds herself as a single mom in Germany with her husband clearly, not around, but not only him not being around, but his wealth having been squandered by his business partners, and her brother saying to her, sorry, you're not getting any of your property back. So she's actually, and she has to put on this face because she's being recognized, she's been treated by high society as an aristocrat. Right, so she's meeting women of high society, and she's being dined, and she's been invited to do to various occasions, and yet she's worried about where is she going to get the next rent payment. How is she going to make the payment? So it's a really interesting kind of negotiation that she has to deal with as well in terms of social mobility. In her case, moving down. But thanks for the, I do think your point about thinking about the specific role of Hamburg, I think is very important, and I do need to, think about it a little more. I mean, I talk in the paper a little bit here about, the competing imperialist, interests of Britain and Germany, and how how they both play her. Use her in some ways in terms of their encroachment in the space of Zanzibar, but how she also tries to manipulate them. She's neither, properly speaking, a victim, nor is she, completely in control of the situation. But it's a really interesting kind of, game to witness how that gets played out. The Germans actually send her on a ship, on a military ship to Zanzibar, in order to put pressure on Bargash. To accede to some of their claims, and as soon as he recognizes that that's going to happen, when he gives in, they completely abandon her. They have no interest in her future anymore. So she's abandoned by the British by this false promise. They basically, as I said earlier, tell her that they'll take care of the kids, and then say, "Oops, sorry, you're not a British subject. We really can't help you anymore." And she's let down by Germans as well. So yeah.
Couple of points. The first is about invention and really reinvention. So one of the inventions that takes place not only among convicts, which really anticipates what's going to happen with indentured labor several decades later, is imagine putting together people from Bengal, Madras, Bombay, and I'm using them as sort of short forms for northeastern India and southern India and western India. They all come together, people who speak a diversity of languages, different religious communities, different ethnicities. They all start thinking of themselves as Hindustanis. So, it's almost like the way when you put on trial, the British put on trial the 3 INA prisoners and took one from each, a Muslim, a Hindu, and a Sikh. And of course, all of India got mobilized because every community felt exercised. And they all invent for themselves a festival that they all celebrate. And in part, this is there in Islamic Muslim Southeast Asia, in part because some of the prisoners in the beginning are Muslims, but they're not necessarily Shiite Muslims. Muharram becomes the festival that they all participate in. Hindu and Muslim indentured laborers do the same when they go to the Caribbean. Several decades later, that becomes, but there are obvious reasons, other reasons why they gravitate towards that festival. It's because it's about the appropriation of public space for a few days. It's about marching out with your taziyas and with your banners and so on, and claiming public space as your own, and having a lot of fun while you're doing it. Because every year there would be police concerns about all these people marching in procession. And whether you were a convict or whether you were an Indian soldier stationed there or you were an Indian businessman, you joined in this festival. It's interesting that they didn't pick other festivals and that so many people participated in them. Although back in India, well, in India it was similar at the beginning of the 19th century. It was one of the big public festivals that Hindus and Muslims and all stripes of Muslims participated. The other sort of archives, I'm envious that they have written sources, and I can actually see all the books that Niall had, and you have your account. And then one of your students asked me about Sea of Poppies. And of course, one is about what we can or cannot invent, even as these people are reinventing themselves, and the licenses that a novelist can take that we can't take. So I can't, even though I know it's true and it rings true, that you can put a Dalit, a big, rugged Dalit man, put him together with a slightly higher caste woman, and then have a European woman who hangs out with Indians and is the daughter of a naturalist, and then you have an African American who's passing himself off as white, and then later on you throw in Parsis and Chinese and mixed marriages and all of that. But I mean, one, I have a lot of respect for Amitav Ghosh because I know he actually goes to the same archives we all do, and there's not a single character or single speech in any of his trilogy that rings false, but yet he can move mountains unlike the way we can in sort of assembling these kinds of scenarios. So there are limits to what one can do depending on the kinds of sources, and archives is of critical importance in all our work in one way or another.
Ananda, I wonder if I could ask you a question which then also relates to the other two papers, and that is, you talk a lot about law.
Yes.
A law with relationship to punishment.
Yes.
With little echoes of Gilbert and Sullivan in the background. Punishment should fit the crime and so forth.
Yes.
But there's a very strong element of morality imputed in that.
Yes.
These are the intersections of moral universes as well. And I'm struck that, as you speak now, that this construction of the notion of a Hindustani is actually an artifact of that very kind of understanding of that universe. Do you want to talk a little bit more about where morality intersects with this? Because we've been talking about it as culture rather than, or sect rather than morality.
Well, the idea of overseas banishment really didn't exist in sort of Hindu legal code. So it's, in that sense, it's an invention, although the idea of exiling people existed prior to the arrival of Islamic law. But the whole system of punishment, colonial punishment, is set up very consciously as an alternative, a civilized alternative to Islamic law. And so the physical kinds of punishments that Islamic law supposedly extended to India was not what colonial law set out to do, and capital punishment actually was not used very extensively, although physical punishments of one sort or another, much more so than the practice of Islamic law, was applied in India. And the whole purpose behind transportation was it was designed to show the quality of mercy that was inherent in colonial law, that it spared so many people. So yes, it executed every important political prisoner who rose up against the British in 1790s in South India, but it spared all their kids and the more distant relatives. So once it lopped off the top layer, it spared the lives of sort of the second echelon and the sons of the various leaders and exiled them. And there was a grand show about how beneficent and benevolent British law was, that it didn't do anything terrible to these people. So transportation is set up in that way. from the India side, but from the receiving end, it's set up as a punishment. Please, please, extend this to many more so we can have more able hands. And don't send us anybody who's old and infirm or too young. We want strong people. And very few women are initially sent out. And also, women are, certain kinds of crimes, for instance, are not prosecuted. Rapes was not something the British really bothered to prosecute. And most of the women who are sent out, and it's like 1 in 100, it's probably less than, it's like 1 to about 4 or 5% of the transportees were ever women. And most of the women who were transported were because they'd murdered their husbands. That was typically what they...
if I may follow up on your comment about Ghosh, because when I was reading your paper, I was of course thinking back on Sea of Poppies as well. I was thinking of Neil, and I was thinking of
Yes.
all those various characters. And just to follow up on your comment, I mean, clearly, and I speak now as a literary critic, not as a historian. The two of you are historians, and I'm a literary critic on this panel. And I'm curious, because clearly those of us who study literature often go to texts such as yours, to help us think through the narratives that the writers are writing. So when I read your paper on the convicts, I'm thinking, okay, this helps put it in perspective. The question I want to ask you, though, is whether when historians read literary texts like either Sea of Poppies, or more importantly, and I think this is where the text I'm really thinking of, In an Antique Land,
Yes.
which sure, In an Antique Land is a text that is based on the Cairo-Geniza materials,
Yes.
but ultimately Boma is a conjecture, right?
Yes.
I mean, ultimately it's a leap of faith, and Ghosh is very clear about making it a leap of faith. So the question I want to ask is, to what extent do you all think, as historians, a text like In an Antique Land, or even Sea of Poppies, actually shifts the discourse and the discipline of history? Not because it's taken as fact, but because it inspires a new way of thinking, a new historical imagination amongst historians, not amongst literary critics. We are more flexible. We can do what we want to do with these texts precisely for the reasons that you talked about. But I'm really curious to know whether historians find those narratives empowering. Because my assessment, at least a very naive, outside of history assessment, is that I think In an Antique Land did more for Indian Ocean studies than perhaps, and maybe it's a sacrilege to say this, but perhaps even Chaudhry's work, right? Which was very much,
Not a sacrilege at all, no.
And Amitabh would be glad to hear that.
So, no, but you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, in terms of inspiring the historical imagination, and I would ask you this, but I'd love to hear this, the answer to this from anyone, really.
Perhaps I have a go at that first. I mean, I'd say yes. I really do think very much with Ghosh's works on Somme and more generally, I think, kind of literary works on the Indian Ocean, I think have really kind of created a discourse among historians of the cosmopolitan. The Indian Ocean is I think, taken unquestionably as has been this cosmopolitan zone. And that's, of course, cosmopolitan in a moral sense, as this is, kind of a good cosmopolitan, rather than, let's say, something coming from economic history in a Marxist kind of, cosmopolitanism and in sort of more ambivalent sense. And to me, I think in a way that's problematic, partly because I think it's often, because we have so few written materials, I think, for the Indian Ocean, particularly for its long periods of history, that I think this actually has enabled a level of projection and certainly assumption that isn't necessarily weighed up in the materials. The materials I've looked at, these various kind of travelogues from, the 19th century, when we have a bunch of people who, one might assume ipso facto, they're educated, etc. Cosmopolitan is often thought to be, at least from its 18th century French origin, something that is urbane, literate, worldly, etc. And yet I find constantly that actually people are actually, the writers are often either very ambivalent, sometimes very negative, sometimes deeply hostile for the peoples they encounter in other regions. And far from these different travellers mixing and kind of hanging out and socialising with various ethnic and religious others, the people that they meet, and they're very keen to find networks of their own kin, diaspora communities that previously exist. That might, I think, perhaps be different among, kind of communities of labourers and others when people are, or convict labourers, when people are forced out to create a new community. But I think my experience is that actually that cosmopolitanism is relatively rare. And as I mentioned, just in passing in my presentation, for me, it's not, I'm not interested in particularly denying that there was a certain cosmopolitanism. but actually saying, well, how and under what circumstances does this come about? And to me, that's kind of, as a historian, let's say, responding to a discourse which has come out of literature, really, and perhaps out of post-colonial theory more generally, and it's really in relation to kind of literary criticism.
Yeah.
So I've actually been in conversation with him over the years and always shared all my work with him. I think he has, yes, helped steer a certain amount of historical research a certain way, particularly his current preoccupation. So River of Smoke, for those of you who haven't read it, sort of ends up in China and brings all the sort of loose threads together. And if you know the history of that period in China, many of the characters are familiar because they're very thinly disguised real people who existed at that time in Guangzhou. But he's now fixated with this idea, and I don't think it's inaccurate, and it also represents something I'm very interested in, that China had a very deep influence and impact on India. How could it not, given the extent to which trade went back and forth? I mean, if you just think of all that opium that flowed one way and all that tea that came back and all the Parsis who were heavily involved in the China trade, how could it not? So all his characters have led him to his current kind of stance, which is he goes around giving this talk about China's imprint on India. And I don't think he's wrong at all. It's not like you need a Tagore in 1905 before people start having Pan-Asian thoughts. I think if you look at the popular level with the kinds of people I deal with, what was the result of their mobility? Not only across India, all those Biharis who moved across India, but all the people from North India, all the people from South India who traveled to other parts of the world and came back to their villages. And some of them did come back. Surely they created a certain kind of vernacular cosmopolitanism in their local communities that made people aware. We just don't have ways, historians have great difficulties getting at those kinds of mentalities because most of these people have not left sources. So my other kind of interest is looking at popular knowledge about China in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it reflects the fact that my parents, or one side of my family, moved in the 1930s from China to India and were involved in India ever since then. So I'm very much interested in that question. And I just finished translating a 300-page Hindi account by an Indian soldier named Gadadhar Singh called Cheen Mein Tera Mas, 13 Months in China. And it's over 300 pages. He writes in great detail about his affection for China, that there he is, this Indian soldier fighting on behalf of the British, but he felt a greater sense of kinship with the Chinese because the Chinese, like himself, were black. And he uses this racial and color terms to describe all the people who are not white. And so this 300-page pain really to that maybe if China and India got together, and he's sort of anticipating BRIC, he says, maybe it's going to be Chindia, and it's going to be the greatest country in the world if China falls under British hands. So so there's a lot more out there. It's, even the text that Niall is constantly digging up, really no work has been done on any of these, and at the levels below them of sort of subalterns who left behind no written sources, we know very little. We largely think that people were not very political and not very global till the nationalist movement developed, and then people started thinking about the nation. But there were all kinds of other things going on that we're just not very familiar with.
Actually, you have a parallel set of experiences now, or in the last several decades, where you have massive amounts of migration from South Asia into the Gulf.
Yes.
And back with fairly profound assumptions about what those effects are, without anything written to tell you that, because for the most part, those are laborers who also don't read and write, or at least don't read and write in the same languages that they're then later encountering.
Yeah, but we're counting we're counting the monies that are flowing in.
Yes.
And so we know that the
Right.
pattern of migration has shifted from Malayalis going from Kerala to now many of the people that I work on have started to move to the Gulf. So
Yes.
many of the people who also moved to Mauritius and Caribbean are now moving to the Gulf.
Right.
Yeah.
Should we take some questions from the audience? Oh dear, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5. We'll stop there for the moment. Sir,
Okay, for Anand, given our long association, I'm sure you can see this coming.
could you all introduce yourself as you're speaking?
Henry Schwartz, Georgetown University, English Department in Justice and Peace. About the criminal tribes being transported to some of these places. We know that Bantu-speaking people populated Andamans, but if you could talk about the route that goes from rounding up the nomads to concentrating them in cities to training them for labor and then sending them elsewhere, that would be fascinating.
Yeah. So even though, as you well know, so this is work that both of us have done in the past, they sort of criminalize the criminal tribes and prosecute some of them. The numbers they prosecute are so few, and the ones caught doing severe enough crimes that they deserve banishment is even smaller. That very small numbers are actually ever banished. And in many, many cases, the British are terrified of sending large numbers of people of the same type overseas, because the fear is the kind of organization they have among themselves will then replicate itself and make it very difficult for local authorities to control them. Therefore, in 1857, when Calcutta says, we're going to clear all our prisons and send you all our worst criminals, and then after that, we're going to send you mutineers. And this is such a Singaporean statement. The Singapore's administrator says, we're now a respectable place. We don't want your riffraff. We want to keep, it's almost like we want to keep Singapore clean. We don't want anyone who chews gum coming to our country kind of thing. You know? So, and that's when transportation to Southeast Asia basically stops.
Yeah.
I'm Dina Khouri from George Washington University. I'm a historian. I have actually a general question for Niall and Anand, which is focused on the issue of sovereignty. As these people are moving in oceanic space, are they moving as British subjects? Are they moving as Persian subjects? Are there papers they have to submit? Because I know by the end of the 19th century, issues of laissez-passer and papers factor into this. So I'm actually interested in how sovereignty, what role does sovereignty works, or ideas of subjecthood, how does that work at this movement of peoples across space? And something a bit more specific for Niall. I like this notion of oceanic languages, but I'm not sure what it does. So if you can sort of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, perhaps I'll start off with that latter question. Yeah, I mean, really with oceanic languages, I'm simply interested in kind of languages that move and come into contact with one another. So in a sense, Urdu in Africa, I mean, I wrote an article that's called Urdu as an African Language. And actually some of even in the 19th century, there were commentators that were predicting, that this would be the case, and indeed we find even earlier in various parts of East Africa that Hindustani had become, kind of in a sense, lingua franca. And that's in a sense what interests me when we have kind of language, movements as well, and particularly when, kind of written records. So text written in Urdu in Africa, or indeed, I mean, other scholars, of course, are working on these Malay texts from South Africa, or indeed in Sri Lanka. So I think that, there really are possible, and of course, Arabic, of course, I mean, which Arabic, of course, is in many ways the obvious one that stretches throughout the Indian Ocean and being in places that we tend to take it for granted, I think, that Arabic should be in so many places, but I think we could in many ways kind of denormalize that and think actually there's something quite extraordinary that Arabic learning should move into so many linguistic and geographies. So that's in a sense what I think is important oceanically, because that sets up then possibilities of conversation across the Indian Ocean within these languages, or indeed texts that move across the Indian Ocean that can be read in different regions, which I think, of course, when we look at the Atlantic world, I think it's a much more straightforward picture, because we have a smaller number of languages, and we have, obviously kind of in the United States, there are many different, in the 19th century, many different publishers in different languages. But nonetheless, I think this is kind of an easier old world, new world conversation going on between language, because effectively the history of kind of settler colonialism really across the Americas. But I think in the Indian Ocean, that's actually kind of much more, much more actually kind of difficult to prove. And that's why I think it's important to try to dig out these texts that are in conversation with one another and languages that do move. Some do and some simply don't. And as I showed with the Japanological text, really, the Japanophilia didn't move into Japanology. There was never a point when Japanese becomes a lingua franca. And the Indians that do go to Japan, effectively, they all end up speaking in English as a lingua franca. So, I mean, clearly English is one of the oceanic languages as well, and that becomes the case, I think, to a lesser extent with Dutch, and of course with French in some regions too. With sovereignty, I don't have a lot to say about that, even though I should. I think yes, surely you're correct. It doesn't come up in my sources very much. And when I'm looking at a later period and other texts I've looked at, particularly, let's say, with Afghanistan, and when that actually becomes a place that starts to have its own foreign policy, its own border controls in 1919. Various of these Urdu travelogues that go to Afghanistan, they're really perplexed and puzzled with this new thing called a passport and a visa, etc. So that kind of makes me think that just on that assumption that if it were so tricky, or certain kinds of papers, pre-passport, let's say in the 1800s, that it would have registered more, I think, in the actual writings if it were so important. Many of them did travel, I think, as imperial citizens, clearly.
Any further response from
So I'll just say very quickly that my study kind of ends in the late 19th century. Prior to a certain time, the issues of sovereignty only come up before the Strait settlements are created in the 1820s, mid-1820s, because everything has to be referenced back to Calcutta. And local authorities can't take certain kinds of judicial decisions about their subjects without getting clearance from Calcutta. So one of the Khan brothers who's prosecuted for burglary and stripped of all his possessions and thrown into jail, London and Calcutta ultimately throw that decision out because Bengkulu had overstepped its legal authorization to make that kind of decision.
We had further questions. We went 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Hi, I'm Judith Tucker from the History Department and also in Arab Studies here. So I wanted to ask if I could just one quick question for each of the speakers. I hope you indulge me in that. It was hard to choose which questions to ask. So first for Gaurav, not sure I'm pronouncing your name well. So it's a wonderful text. It's one I'm fairly familiar with because I actually teach it in a travel class. And so I think my question has to do with the fact that she is a stunning observer of German society. I mean, really one of the finest, kind of reverse gaze examples we have, I think. And, for example, you mentioned in your paper the theater. She goes to the German theater, and her way of sort of taking that apart and understanding representation, and particularly the representation of the other and how it's done, is really remarkable, I think. So I guess the big question I've always had about her is, why is she such a good observer, Is it her gender? Is it the fact that she comes out of this special hybrid society? Is it something in her background? Is there some key to understanding better the cosmopolitanness of the space that she came from? So I think that's my question, just to ask you to reflect a little bit about, why she is actually so very good at understanding or letting us see this strange place, Germany, which she yet does with such sensitivity and understanding. Yeah. So, what is it?
All three questions, and then
yes. Okay. And then I think for Niall, I was going to ask about in the paper you have this great the steam Hajj, which I thought was a great way to think about it. But I wondered, it seems that you're making a claim, and I might be wrong about this, but it seems that your argument is that there's something very new going on here in terms of what these travelers, these Hajj accounts are. Well, I'm not sure. Here's my question. Is it what they're seeing or is it how they're seeing it? Because you talk about the fact that they're very taken with, urban spaces and technologies they see, and they also engage in kind of a sort of systematic ethnography. And I think back to earlier Hajj accounts, and I think, okay, well, also people did, not all of them, but some of them do, for example, practice ethnography. They talk a lot about the, manners and customs of the people they encounter. And they talk about the physical spaces that they pass through. So, is your argument that there is actually a new way of seeing going on as well as just new things to see in the kind of post-STEAM era? Yeah. And then for Anand, I was interested in what you could tell us perhaps about the differences between communities of transported laborers and communities of indentured laborers. And what is it? Are there differences in the intensity and the type of work, in the social organizations of the communities, in the role that gender plays? That would be really interesting to hear about. Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen. You want to start with Gaurav?
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, sure. No, I think it's ultimately, I think, an unanswerable question, as you know, having taught that text. But I think that what's interesting to me about it is that she seems to be a very perceptive observer right from childhood. When she's talking about, for instance, her own family background, she's talking about race relations, even within her household. When she's talking about her own relationship with her father versus some of the others, she seems to be unique in some ways. So I think you're right that, she comes from a context in which she is very privileged, and she does have lots of difference to handle right up front, so she's very keen to note difference, right? Whether it's racial, gendered, class, she's very aware of class. She's very, arrogant about it, but nevertheless she's aware of it, right? So there's that, certainly. She also is a rebel, as you know, from her childhood, right? She doesn't want to do the girl things, right? She wants to ride horses, she wants to do, she wants to write, she wants to do all the things that, are against the kind of conventions that she might be asked to inhabit. So in that sense, I think she is kind of, in some ways, unique, which I'm sure, ultimately translates into the kinds of powers of imagination and critique and cross-cultural observation that I think you notice. But I think she's also a wonderful thinker. When I teach the text, her text to the class, I say, we are now very familiar, in 1978 on, we're very familiar with the conception of Orientalism, right? But here's a text written 100 years before Said, which essentially makes the same kinds of arguments about the way in which the Orient is fabricated. And I also bring in Michel Foucault, because, there's that wonderful argument of Michel Foucault's where he says that what is truth? Well, in order for it's something to become a truth, it has to be what he says, dans le vrai, right? Which means it's a truth becomes a truth because it is a circulation, right? It's part of a larger circulation of discourses, right? Which confirm each other. And she literally does that, demonstrates that when she's talking about observations of Zanzibari custom. She says, one person comes, says something about Zanzibar, goes back to Europe, a second person comes, says something similar, and then the third and the fourth person aren't actually necessarily doing any observations, they're just reciting the people who came before. And that's how things become truth. They get repeated over and over and over again, and then all of a sudden they emerge as the truth about the Oriental woman. So she's got all these wonderful, ways of critiquing, not pure observation, but also critique, real engagement with discourse and construction. So I think you're right. I think that's why she's such a... And then, of course, we may not agree with, in fact, we don't often agree with all of her ultimate judgments on societal values and whatnot. But she's a great debater. I mean, when she takes on the issue of slavery, regardless of whether or not we might support her claims, she actually engages in a, it's like a debate class. She says, you say this, well, I say this. You say that, I say that. And so she is, in that sense, I think, quite unique.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I mean, I'm tempted to think that there is an increasing kind of ethnographic shift in the 18th and 19th century with greater description. But and I think it's partly because when we look at the early modern medieval travelogues, we tend to pick out as scholars those more interesting ones more than I think the more generic ones. Whereas I think by the 19th century, certainly, there are not only a huge number of these texts, but it's actually quite normal, even in guidebooks, to have much more personal information. But I'm always uncomfortable with trying to measure gazes and things that, I'm a bit of a British empiricist, and if I can't, if it's too intangible, then I'd give up. But in terms of your other question about what is going on there with the Hajj in the 19th century and what is different about that, I read an article a year or two ago in Past and Present with perhaps the overbold title of The Hajj as Its Own Undoing, and argued in there about the steam Hajj, that the Hajj in the age of steam, the steam Hajj, becomes an entirely different creature than this earlier Hajj. The actual places that the Hajj as a journey involves are these new geographies of cities like, depending where you're coming from, Singapore, Bombay, Aden, Ismailia. These cities that not only in many cases didn't really exist before, and certainly not in the terms that they did in the 19th century, but are full of communities and peoples largely non-Muslim, whether Europeans, Italians, French, whether all kinds of people who are washing up in Singapore and Bombay, that this actually doesn't become anymore a Muslim journey. And indeed, in many of the travelogues I looked at from that period, we see this interesting, so it's not only that the journey itself is not the Hajj of old, and not through Muslim memory spaces, Damascus, the overland Hajj route, of course, across Arabia itself, or the various traditional overland routes of maqams and manzils and so on. The actual measurement of time and space in these travelogues becomes a language of the minute, or the mile, or the kilometre, these kind of loan words of a new space that is actually borrowed. So both the entire kind of space-time of the Hajj, the actual concrete physicality of the Hajj as a journey on the way to Mecca, is an entirely different thing to the early period. And this is what I argued then, that it was in a sense a Hajj as its own undoing, because it's no longer a journey through Muslim memory space anymore, through old saintly shrines, etc., but actually through this new and puzzling and deeply un-Islamic space. And it's only when they actually get to the Hijaz, which becomes paradoxically, well, not paradoxically, just simply is, the least infrastructurally and least developed place upon the whole of the journeys. That's the last stage, the only bit that people have to do by donkey and mule. It's the place that, of course, is the center of many cholera epidemics. And a number, in varying degree, but a number of these travelogues are actually kind of deeply critical about Mecca at the end of the journey as well, that this place is, frankly, filthy. It's a place of cholera, it's a place of disease, it's a place to be cheated and robbed. So again, this kind of older idea of an idealized pious Hajj, possibly pious because so few people can do it, in this age of democratization, and indeed kind of these new steam geographies, becomes, as I'd argued, perhaps over-argued, a Hajj that is its own undoing.
There are lots of similarities, but there are also lots of differences. So just as coerced labor with convicts is an extension to a certain extent of slavery, and in fact the early officials are called superintendent of convicts and slaves. And so African slaves typically, let's say in places like Bengkulu, from Mozambique and Madagascar, work side by side with Indian convicts. And since the convicts were 99.9% at this point, 99% male, they often intermarried. So lots of relationships between African female slaves and Indian men that produce these mixed marriages. But they're not related. I mean, in some ways, seeing how effective convict labor was made local authorities, when they needed much larger inputs of labor, turn to India. So once plantation agriculture was developed, they need such large labor inputs in the hundreds of thousands that they turn to India and start bringing them in. And so it's different from convict labor in that we're talking about much larger numbers. We're talking about people coming through sort of connections, local kinds of connections, so all coming from one place or another. So there are certain kinds of migrant streams that flow towards different parts of the world. But to every place that indentured labor goes, whether it's in the Caribbean or whether it's in the Indian Ocean or whether it's in the Pacific Ocean, all those were places at one point or another that the British thought of sending Indian convicts to. They decide not to send them to the West Indies. They decide after a while to stop sending them to Aden and St. Helena and places like that. But every place that indentured laborers go to, at some point someone says, let's send the convicts there. Mauritius, of course, is the best example of where, starting in 1830s, as the number of convicts, as that sort of flow is being halted, they decide they need large numbers of laborers. And so it's Indians brought in from certain areas of India. And then the gender mix is very different because after a while the British introduce a rule that for every 10 males there have to be X number of females, usually 3 or 4. So it's a much more gender balanced migration than the convicts.
Do we have any further questions? Yes, please. In the back.
I'm Ananya Chakravarti. I'm in the Department of History as well. My question is for Niall. I should admit I'm an early modernist, so all of your papers begin at a point later than my own research. But I was very taken with this notion of newness that you're working with and the idea that there is something different about the imperial age as opposed to the early modern Indian Ocean. That being said, I'm particularly taken with the ways in which you were thinking through intellectual history as a place to think about newness. And here, I mean, you say that you wanted to stay away from European models of intellectual history. But I wonder if in doing that, I mean, sort of traditional questions of, say, authorship or circulation of elusive networks of meaning or genres, et cetera, I wonder if then maybe you are sidestepping the question of newness? Because if you see things like Safarnama or even something like the Mikado Nama, right? And like, you know, or these older genres that are being repurposed, are these then still speaking within these traditions or these longer intellectual histories, sort of Persianate or Indian Ocean, however you want to cast it? Or are these really, is this a beginning of a completely new kind of intellectual life in the Indian Ocean? Especially when you go back to the question of, you know, whether or not these books are being built on the backs of English language bibliographies as opposed to sort of Chashmadid Gawah kind of real eyewitness accounts. So I wonder if you could sort of think through that a little bit further and how you would position texts like these within longer genealogies.
Right, yeah, well, thank you. I'll certainly try to. And I was once an early modernist, and I am perhaps one day a week anyway, so it's nice to kind of try to join things up. I mean, you're certainly right that I think, you know, these genres, of course, the Safarnama in particular, have had, you know, kind of longer histories. And I think in many ways that's not entirely surprising when we look at, let's say, within European intellectual history, the essay from, you know, Montaigne, of course, 16th century, you know, is still the dominant kind of form of, you know, kind of intellectual discussion in the age of Huxley or others, you know, in the High Victorian period. So I think that, in a sense, is that the actual, you know, kind of genres do change much more slowly. And I think, to me, that's not entirely surprising. I'm not talking about a revolutionary set of kind of new genres. But nonetheless, I mean, there are important changes insofar as, and that's my point towards, let's say, vernacularization as I think, in terms of the writing and printing level, something that's really new. Of course, Urdu as a prose language, effectively doesn't really exist till the 19th century. So, and of course, to me, this is, in a sense, what's interesting with this issue of cosmopolitanism, because the very, you know, when we're talking about, you know, cosmopolitan, to me, that really must, if it has any kind of robust basis, the very least it must have is a common language of interaction. Yet, of course, by the 19th century, those common languages, particularly Persian, and to a large extent Arabic as well, those are giving way, of course, to imperial lingua francas, but increasingly, in fact, to new vernacular and national and kind of group languages. So the fact that there's an Urdu Safarnama, okay, it's old because there's a Safarnama, but actually the fact that it's in Urdu prose is extremely new. So I think there's, kind of a level of, this isn't revolutionary novelty, but I think it is new. And I think it's also the subject matter of newness too. And one of the things I'm increasingly interested in is in fact, the ways in which these older genres and different linguistic registers, different languages plainly put, try to cope with the new scientific world. Now, a text I worked on a while back, and I didn't bring it up here, was one of the last Indo-Persian travelogues by Solojong II of Hyderabad. And he goes everywhere. It's a grand tour of Europe. It's a Mediterranean rather than Indian Ocean travelogue. And he ends up in what happens to be my home city, Birmingham. So I thought that's kind of interesting. And, the center of the workshop of the world, as we're told growing up, this place of the Industrial Revolution. He goes on this tour of all of the factories of Birmingham. But at the same point, he's trying to write in this very pure kind of Saf Farsi register that he won't, unlike Urdu uses of the period, he won't let in a single loan word. So the problem is he doesn't have any vocabulary in this kind of early modern vocabulary he's using, if you like, in the 1880s. He doesn't have any vocabulary for the things he's seeing, including the first plastic machines, inventing plastic. So I think, to me, that's the point when the real kind of the new intellectuals of the 19th century, the likes of, the heirs of Sir Said and, kind of many other kind of, other trajectories we don't know about in Indian intellectual history, those figures are much more happy to use Urdu because it's a language that is, you can borrow any old word into Hindi. Hairdresser is suddenly an Urdu word, isn't it? And that's fine. Plastic, no doubt, too. So I think, again, when we look at comparing languages, there's actually kind of very new things that are happening. And, of course, I would... I'd be interested to know with what other languages around the Indian Ocean compared to, say, the older cosmopolitan languages, Arabic, let's say, and, let's say Malay or something else that's coming into, well, Malay's an older written language, but other vernaculars that are coming into writing that period. Is the, kind of differences between vernaculars actually, even though they're seen to be perhaps more less respectable for some, for cultural conservatives, for intellectual higher discourse, those are the places where real new ideas and discussions are able to take place, because they're much more kind of, kind of spongy languages that aren't concerned with policing their linguistic boundaries. Thank you for the question.
Could we take one last question, since I think we're inching toward the end of our time here? Sir.
My name is Moaz Hyatt, and I'm a student here at Georgetown. My name is Moaz Hyatt, and I'm a student here at Georgetown. So my question is for all the panelists, and it kind of focuses on that regardless of whether this is a cosmopolitan or not cosmopolitan era, this kind of multicultural interaction we're having, when I look at the question of how we should consider or analyze the Indian Ocean, I keep coming up to this element of colonialism, and that is, so much of this is only possible with this Pax Britannia of colonialism, whether it's the steam Hajj, it's convicts building the places for the steam Hajj, or it's, analyzing European ideas. These are all really coming from this element of this is possible because of colonialism. I think that's the issue when we could discuss sovereignty, or when we think of the Indian Ocean now, is now that that's gone, obviously it's great because we're all, all these countries are independent, but that interaction's gone too. The lingua franca of Hindustani is collapsed, to some extent. So I wanted to know, what do you guys think about this kind of a root element of colonialism in this interesting narrative we're discussing? So, thank you.
Well, just very short answer. So if you read Sunil Amrit's wonderful book on Bay of Bengal, he rightly points out that actually this cosmopolitan world falls apart in the late 19th and 20th century. That yes, there was a certain kind of commingling that occurred as a result of the framework provided by European colonial rule, but it really followed on the heels of a much earlier kind of interaction that had been occurring all across the Indian Ocean. So you kind of have to jump from K.N. Chowdhury's book about the Indian Ocean, which sort of ends in sort of the eve of colonial rule, to our kind of work, which is in the colonial period, which also sees this kind of intermixing, to Sunil Amrit and others who talk about this world falling apart over the course of the early 20th century. And now the attempts by policymakers to see strategic connections across this world, which in an odd sort of way reproduces these connections that other people had forged in much earlier times, either through commerce or culture or religion or people who moved across this world. So whether it's India talking about a string of pearls that is choking it as a result of China's naval strategy, or India trying to build up Andamans and its Indian Ocean fleet, or Robert Kaplan talking about how important this whole world is for US strategic purposes, they're talking about a world that actually had been created much, much earlier in many interesting and different ways that ebbed and flowed depending on what century you're talking about. So yes, I think there's something that happens during colonial rule, but it's not, to use his word, new.
Do you have any last comments from our three panelists? Something you want people to walk away remembering, besides everything you've talked about thus far?
That's a big ask.
That's a big ask. Go ahead. Can I then thank everyone for staying, for coming, for your questions, for your attentiveness, to our panelists.